Hello, it's the 14th of April and I think I'm going to put these tomato plants into their larger pots in the greenhouse because they're getting quite large. There's still likely to be some frosts this year. I've kept the tomato seedlings in the greenhouse and I've only covered them if the predicted temperature was going to drop below zero, and so we've certainly had situations in the greenhouse where the thermometer in the greenhouse has registered zero, but that doesn't seem to have done any harm to the tomato plants, so I'm fairly confident of planting them in the pots in the greenhouse. And if we do get any predicted frosts where the temperatures are -1 or -2, then I might just put something over them in order to stop them, to avoid the risk of them freezing. Tomatoes are the same type of plant as potatoes, and you know how susceptible they are to frost, but nevertheless they seem to have coped okay. I think, as I've explained in some earlier videos, I'm going to have a bit of a tomato fest this year. I got 14 heritage varieties of tomatoes which I decided to grow from seeds. So before I do anything else here, I want to take you back to the 12th of February when I planted these. It's the 12th of February today in southern England, and I'm going to plant some tomato seeds. This is the first time that I've planted tomato seeds for a few years. I've been using grafted tomatoes which have been sent to me by post. They were said to have higher yields, and it was a bit easier perhaps having tomato plants arrive that had already grown. However, each year there's always been some kind of complication. Sometimes the plants were very small, sometimes the plants were excessively big. You weren't entirely sure what time or when they were going to arrive, and they didn't cope with travelling very well, so they were quite often not very well when they got here. And last year I finally got fed up with trying to nurse these tomato plants back to health, and I thought that I would go back to what I used to do in the old days, which was to grow tomato plants from seed. And this year I thought I'd celebrate starting to do that by having something of a tomato fest. I've got space for 14 self-watered pots in the greenhouse, and I thought I'd have 14 different varieties of heritage tomatoes, and now is the time to start them off. Okay, let's have a look at what I've done already. As you can see, I've brought together a motley collection of plastic pots that I already had. Clearly, if I was starting this from scratch and I didn't have any pots, I would get biodegradable ones of one kind or another, but I figure it's the greenest thing to do to keep reusing these pots time and time again rather than disposing of them. I've filled them up with multi-purpose compost. You could use seed compost. I find that seeds by and large germinate perfectly well in multi-purpose compost, so that works for me. They're in heated propagator trays. These are lids for the propagator, which I will put on when I've planted the seeds. I've left them all in the propagators with the heats on for a couple of days just to bring up the temperature of the soil in the pots. It's quite cold here at the moment, and measuring the soil temperature, they're only around 16 degrees C. Tomatoes germinate best in the high 20s, and often 20 or 21 degrees is quoted as the temperature for germinating. In fact, they will germinate down to 10 degrees, so I'm not worried about these low temperatures, but clearly they do need heated propagators. The other thing I've done is put labels in the pots already, because I just find that a little bit easier. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is to make a little indentation in 2 locations in the pot, not very deep, no more than 3 or 4 millimetres at most. I'm then going to get some seeds and put one in the bottom of each little indentation. I'm then going to just press the seed down onto the soil as to make sure there's good contact. Different people will have different approaches to this, but they're all effectively trying to do the same thing, which is to not bury them too deep, to make sure they're in good contact with the compost. I'm going to now just sprinkle some dry compost over the top into the holes. I just push that down because it's not going to dislodge the seeds now, and then I'm just going to give it a little spray of water just to bed it in. Okay, so it just remains to put the lids back on the propagator, and they can stand there by this window with the curtains open until we get some germination.
When the seedlings had got to about 1 inch high, I just put them in a tray in the greenhouse and left them to get to their current stage.
While they've been in the greenhouse, they've been in this shallow tray, and I've kept that topped up with water. That's kept enough water around the bottom of the pots to keep the plants nice and moist, but not so much that the roots became drowned. So that means that they only need to be checked every so often to see that they've not dried out. These are the 14 that I intend to plant. I've got quite a lot of others now that I'll be giving away, but these looked like the best for me to begin with.
In my video 28, I talked about managing the greenhouse environment, about managing the temperature, the amount of sunlight getting in, and also about my automatic watering system. Do look at video 28 if you want to know what I've done in relation to temperature control. In terms of the automatic watering system, I'm going to repeat that now because I've also added 1 or 2 extra additions to that, so it's useful to see the whole thing in one go. One of the problems about growing things in a greenhouse is what do you do when you go away, because things need watering, often within a week. I've tried various solutions over the years. To start with, they were about dripping water at certain times into the tops of pots and troughs using timers and the like. The big drawback with every single one of those is that it's the system that's deciding when to water, not the plants. 2 plants that look identical standing right next to each other may end up drawing quite different amounts of water. And I finally found a solution that works where the plants take up the water they want, and that's very much like the system I used with the seedlings, with that tray. I keep a very small depth of water in the bottom of the pots, not enough to flood the roots. Word of caution here, 1 year, long ago, before I knew better, I almost filled the troughs that contained the pots up to the top with water, so that they would be in water while we were away. Flooding the roots of a tomato plant, and I guess many plants, is the very quickest way to kill them. But having a very small depth of water in the bottom of the pots is great. If all the rest of the pot is damp, if all the rest of the soil in the pot is damp, it just draws the water it wants. And I've got a system now that does that completely automatically with no input at all. It's simply achieved by having a trough which the pots will stand in with a ball valve. I'll show you in due course how this is actually connected into the water supply system. But there's a ball valve, and when it gets up to the right level to just keep a little bit in the bottom of the pots, it turns its own water off, so that there can be some space for the water in the trough. I've got these frames that the pots stand on, so they stand in the bottom of the trough, and then the pots stand on top of that, and the water level is set such that it's just at the right depth when the ball valve shuts off the flow. Let me show you some of this in action. Okay, the starting point is this water butt here, which can be filled through a hose connector here that's got a ball valve on the inside, so it won't overflow. Coming from the tap is a pipe. One pipe goes this way to a nozzle with a tap on, so that it's possible to fill a watering can and use this water for other purposes at the end of the garden. And the other section of the pipe goes inside the greenhouse.
Inside the greenhouse, a pipe runs the length of the greenhouse to a manifold that has taps on it, and then pipes to each of the troughs that I showed you. Coming back to look at this trough, it's only got one pot in it at the moment. Most of the four other troughs have 3 pots in them. This one just has 2 as a remnant of the days when I grew 2 cucumbers at this end of the greenhouse. You can see the pot, you can see the ball valve, and you can see the support I showed you on which the pots stand. Now let's turn on the tap for this trough. And we'll leave it to fill up. Okay, well that's the trough filled up, and the ball valve has now turned off the flow. The floor of the greenhouse isn't totally level, so I've got some blocks that I know are the right size that get it up to being level, but let me just check. We've got a depth in the tank of 6 centimetres at that end, and a depth of about 6 centimetres at that end, so the tank is level, and that has led us to a depth in the bottom of the pot of just about 2 centimetres, which will be the reservoir for the water that the plants can draw up. The next thing I'm going to do is fill these pots up with peat-free organic compost. I'm not going to fill them to the top. There's a point on these pots where the slope changes and you get this vertical bit that's about 1 inch and a bit deep, and I'm only going to fill to the bottom of that. And the reason for that is that I want the top as a reservoir. I did think with this automatic watering system that everything could be automatic. I calculated the appropriate amount of tomato feed if the feed was going to be put into the pots continuously, and put that in the tank, in the big water butt. Unfortunately, something in the tomato feed precipitated out, and it left a kind of a white scum inside the tank.
So unfortunately I can't do it that way. So the way to do it is to water tomato feed when needed into the tops of the pots, and having this little gap of an inch and a bit at the top leaves a little bit of a reservoir for the for the water to be in. I think the white deposit that you can see around the top of these tanks must be exactly that. It's probably what's precipitated out of the tomato feed, and that wants to be in the roots of the tomatoes, not in the tank. After the compost is in the pot, the next thing to do is to plant the tomatoes. I'll do that out here because it's a bit easier than doing it in the greenhouse. Just making a bit of a pot sized hole in the compost. Then we've got one of our tomato plants. I'll just bed that in. Give it a bit of a watering to help it settle down. And then I'll put that in one of the troughs in the greenhouse.
I've got these plastic chalkboards above each location for the tomatoes, and they're really good because when you mark them, it never fades. It stays like that for the whole season. It's dead easy to rub off, and to put the name of the next plant to be there. And this one's going to be Brandywine. I've left it all overnight, and I've just come back and checked that the water levels are right, the ball valve adjustments are correct, and that there aren't any leaks. There's just one more thing, and that is you can see that all the troughs are now covered. If the water in the troughs is left uncovered, it turns green. I've cut some pieces of thin plywood to the shape of the pots, and I've slotted them around the pots to keep the sunlight off the water in the troughs, and that's fine, there's no problem then. Okay, well, I hope you've found something useful or interesting in this video, and as ever, thank you very much for watching.